Imagine yourself as a Roman legionary standing in a column, so long you can no longer see its end. The sky darkens even though it is still midday. Rain falls like a heavy curtain drumming against iron helmets in a cold, hollow rhythm. Every step sinks deep into the mud, followed by a wet, sucking sound, as if the ground itself is trying to hold you back. Your shield grows heavier. Your armor feels like a cage. The forest stands silent, not the silence of peace, but the silence of waiting. And then from behind the trees, the hiss of a spear. Nearly 20,000 men, a professional army, 3 legions carrying Rome's most sacred symbols. They did not lose in a single glorious moment meant for statues and speeches. They were broken in a far crueler way, stretched out, cut apart, exhausted, and then erased from the map like ink washed away by rain. When the sun finally broke through again, all that remained was a filthy road littered with abandoned gear and a question hanging in the air. What just happened? No one heard a trumpet call. Only the creak of wood, the sound of men shouting to one another through the rain, and then silence. When an army loses its bearings, history changes direction with it. How could a war machine like Rome be crushed without anything resembling a great battle? Who led them into this? And if Rome was an empire that never forgave humiliation, why did it never truly cross that line again to conquer Germania as planned? Because there is a man here whose name you have to remember. Not a ghost from the deep forest. A man who understood how Rome thought, how it marched, what it trusted. He spoke their language, wore their armor, and understood their most lethal weakness, the habit of believing that everything could be turned into order. You will see why Rome trusted him completely, and why a single word of guidance could become a death sentence. And then there is the forest itself. To the Romans, terrain was something to overcome, an obstacle on the road to victory. In Germania, terrain does not stay still. It strangles formations, devours supply lines, blinds scouts, and turns discipline into a burden. You will see how rain, mud marshes, and narrow paths became weapons that required no steel, only time. Finally, there was the thing that drove Rome to obsession: the legionary eagles. Not just symbols mounted on poles, but collective souls, reminders that each man belonged to something greater than himself. When an eagle fell into enemy hands, Rome did not see it as the loss of a banner. They saw it as the loss of honor, the loss of an oath, the loss of the story of invincibility itself. And that obsession would last for years. This was not just a defeat. This was the moment an empire realized that some lands could not be ruled by familiar formulas, could not be domesticated with laws, taxes, and a few hastily built forts. To understand why 20,000 men vanished, we have to look again at what Rome called order and what Germania truly was. Rome entered the 9th year after Christ with the posture of an empire so accustomed to victory that it treated victory as a given. You no longer asked if you would win, only whether you would win quickly or slowly. Under Augustus, the empire felt like a machine running smoothly roads, expanding outward laws, spreading like a net tax revenue flowing in like a tide. Regions that had been labeled barbarian yesterday now had tax collectors, garrisons, Roman signage, and stone plaques carved with the emperor's name. And that was the most dangerous thing about Rome. It governed the world through habit. It is believed that any land, no matter how stubborn, would eventually soften under the steady repetition of disciplined seals, ledgers, and soldiers. The empire did not conquer with the sword alone. It was conquered by turning victory into an administrative process. But Germania was not a province. It was not a country where you captured the capital and called it done. It was a living maze, a land where tribes drifted like pieces of wood on moving water, joining and separating according to interest, season, and old grudges. Today, they were allies. Tomorrow, they vanished. Today, they accepted gifts. Tomorrow, they led you into a bog. On a map, you could draw a border. On the ground, that border was little more than a comforting idea. There was the Rhine, a clean cut on parchment Roman order, to the west forests, and marshes to the east. But the forests of Germania did not sit still like a patch of green ink. They moved in the way they distorted sight, in the way they swallowed sound, in the way they turned every road into a choke point. Marshes needed no walls. They only needed you to misstep once, and an entire column would be forced to slow down to pull itself free. These were not places meant to be conquered. They were places meant to wear you down, places where terrain and weather did the work that armies usually had to do themselves. And the man sent to turn that maze into order was Varus. Publius Quinctilius Varus was not the kind of legendary general stories love to celebrate. He was not Alexander. He was not Caesar. Varus was exactly the kind of man a stable empire prefers a competent official who knew how to enforce laws, collect taxes, and turn chaos into paperwork. In Rome's eyes, that was success, because if a region was already pacified, you didn't need a hero. You needed a manager. Varus carried Rome's familiar belief. With him, impose rules, build forts, demand tribute, enforce Roman law, and eventually everyone would adapt. But that was the mindset of an administrator stepping into a form of warfare he had not yet learned to name. Varus did not enter Germania like a hunter. He entered like an auditor. He believed the greatest danger in this land was inefficiency, late taxes, uncooperative communities, a few disgruntled groups that needed to be taught a lesson. He assumed that any violence would resemble the suppressions Rome already knew: a quick show of force, a handful of ringleaders executed, and order restored. And when you believe that, you begin to dismiss the very things that should make your skin crawl: the unnatural silence of the locals, reports that sound too clean, assurances that feel a little too reasonable. Then the news arrived. A revolt somewhere in the region, not a major one, at least not on paper. Exactly the sort of situation a governor like Varus was meant to handle. March out, display authority, hold trials, intimidate, stabilize. Varus decided to move the army, and this was the most important decision in the entire disaster. He chose to march through the forest along a route described as faster, safer, avoiding dangerous areas. If you're wondering why a commander would take a heavy column into wooded terrain, he did not fully control. The answer is both mundane and lethal, because he believed he was carrying out an administrative task, not walking into a strategic trap. Someone told Varus this route was secure. Someone reassured him that the local tribes were still under control, that this was only the work of a few troublemakers. Someone promised to gather additional native allies to smooth things over, and Varus listened, not because he was foolish, but because the Roman system trained him to trust that kind of person: locals who had been Romanized, who had served in the army, who understood discipline, who knew exactly how to speak in a way that made Romans feel safe. That was the blind spot of an empire you trust most: the things that look like you. And so the column began to turn away from the roads Rome understood: open, visible, easy to deploy upon, and into a world bent by trees, rain, mud, and blind corners you could not see past. They did not know that in Germania, information was a weapon, and whoever controlled the information controlled their lives. We've mentioned the guide. The man who convinced Varus this was only a minor disturbance, the man who understood Rome deeply enough to predict how it would react, and Germania deeply enough to know how the forest would fight for him. And that man was not an outsider at all. He was the perfect product of Rome itself. Arminius was not a barbarian warlord stepping out of the forest with painted skin and a wild scream. He was something far more dangerous: a man trained by Rome, born among the Cherusci. Arminius grew up on what Rome called the periphery, but Rome itself pulled him inward. He was taken into the imperial world, trained under Roman discipline, taught how to march, how to obey orders, how to think like an officer. He served in the Roman army, fought under Roman banners, and was given command within auxiliary units. In Roman records, Arminius was a success story, a native who had been civilized, loyal, useful, trustworthy. That was precisely what made him a threat Rome never saw coming. Arminius did not understand Rome from the outside. He understood it from the inside. He knew how legions functioned when everything followed the plan. He knew when officers trusted reports and when they ignored warnings because they sounded like background noise. He understood that Rome's greatest strength was not individual bravery, but collective discipline, and that discipline, when placed in the wrong environment, could become a set of chains. Rome was a machine designed to win under familiar conditions. Arminius understood every gear in that machine. Arminius's weapon was not the spear, not the shield, not superior numbers. His weapon was a Roman habit. The way they marched when they believed a region was already pacified. The way they dragged along heavy logistics because they did not expect serious resistance. The way they trusted local allies who had served before, sworn loyalty before, and worn Roman armor before. Rome had a structural blind spot. It distrusted enemies, but it trusted things that looked like itself. And Arminius looked just Roman enough to never be questioned. This is the lethal paradox of empires. They do not collapse from a lack of information, but from trusting the information that confirms what they already believe. Rome believed Germania was being slowly domesticated. That resistance was localized and temporary. Arminius did not need to convince them of this. They already believed it. All he had to do was not contradict it. Arminius also understood something many Germanic leaders did not or refused to accept. You cannot defeat Rome in a single glorious battle. That was Rome's stage. On that stage, formation's armor and discipline crushed everything else. To win, you had to deny Rome the stage entirely. You had to ensure the legions never stood where they wanted to stand. You had to turn the war into days of exhaustion, confusion, and erosion. Not fighting to win immediately, but fighting to make the enemy stop being themselves. The alliance Arminius built was not based on abstract ideals or promises of glory. It was built on very specific resentments. Tribes were forced to pay taxes to a distant power. Families who lost sons to auxiliary service and never saw them return. Warriors who realized that Roman peace meant living under someone else's laws. Arminius gathered these grievances without needing to turn them into a unified nation, only into a shared objective, sustained for long enough. He promised loot, not distant visions, but concrete rewards, food weapon supplies carried by Roman columns. He chose terrain over timing. Dense forests, marshes, narrow roads, where Roman formations stretched thin, where heavy armor became a burden, where cavalry could not maneuver. In these places, every Roman advantage inverted itself. What made the plan especially dangerous was that it did not require perfect coordination in a single moment. It required patience. Arminius's plan was not a decisive battle. It was a process of carving. Each attack was a small cut, enough to draw blood, not enough to kill, enough to force the column to stop, to react, to expend energy, enough to inject doubt into what they believed was control. By the time Rome realized this was not harassment, but a deliberate hunt, there would be no good choices left. This was a war designed to win through time. Then came the most important moment, the moment that sounded completely reasonable. Arminius approached Varus with a familiar proposal. He needed to leave the column briefly to gather additional local allies to ensure the suppression was swift and clean. This was not a suspicious request. This was exactly what a loyal auxiliary officer would do. Varus agreed without hesitation, because in his eyes, Arminius was not an unpredictable tribal leader. He was part of the Roman system, and so Arminius turned away, took his men, and vanished into the trees. No alarm was raised. No formations were adjusted. The Roman column continued forward, longer, slower, heavier, believing everything was still under control. They did not know that the man who had just left was not seeking reinforcements. He was closing the last door out of the forest. When Arminius disappeared among the trees, Rome still believed it was in control. The Roman column kept moving forward, but what was crawling through the forests of Germania now no longer resembled an army in any meaningful sense. It had become a human chain stretched so long that no one could see its beginning or its end. At the front marched the regular legionaries, iron armor clashing in rhythm with each step. Behind them came the cavalry, then the auxiliary units, and behind them the wagons carrying food tools for building camps, spare weapons, draft animals, slaves, servants, merchants, and all the people who followed armies to survive. Every person carried a piece of the empire with them, and when all of that was threaded onto a single narrow road, the empire began to look more fragile than it ever had on a map. A legion survives on its ability to transmit orders quickly and clearly. Here commands had to travel down a column of exhausted men through rain and wind, around bends where shouted words were swallowed whole. Officers at the front had no idea what was happening at the rear. Men in the rear moved forward only because the man ahead of them was still moving. When a wagon bogged down, everything behind it stopped. When a horse slipped, the line compressed. The formation stretched, thinned, and fractured, and each fragment began to live its own separate reality. An army like this was no longer a single body. It was a current, and currents do not turn quickly. Rome's core strength had always been its ability to see the enemy and hold formation. When you can see your opponent, you know how to align ranks, when to advance, when to halt, and when to pivot. In the forests of Germania, vision died first. Dense trees shredded space into pieces. Narrow paths forced soldiers into long files. Marshland pressed right up against the road, and a single misstep meant boots sinking deep and formations unraveling. Soft ground turned every step into labor. Here, the phalanx was no longer a wall of steel. It was an idea that could not be executed. Rome was built to fight on open ground, where discipline and heavy armor created an overwhelming advantage. Germania turned those same strengths into burdens. When you cannot maneuver, discipline becomes rigidity. When you cannot see beyond a few meters, heavy armor drags you down. When you do not know where the enemy is, every direction feels like the front. In spaces like this, tactical superiority does not vanish all at once. It erodes quietly, steadily, and irreversibly. Then the weather joined the fight, not as background, but as an antagonist. The rain did not come and go. It stayed. It soaked cloaks, seeped into armor, sank into skin. Shields grew heavier by the hour. Bowstrings absorbed water and lost their strength. Cold metal clung to the body, drawing out heat and energy. Wind threaded through the forest, carrying damp and chill, slowing everything down. Sound warped. Rain fell so densely it swallowed voices whole. All that remained was labored breathing boots sucking at mud metal, scraping against metal. A monotonous soundtrack of exhaustion. As the weather dragged on, it did more than drain bodies. It ate away at morale. Soldiers grew irritable. Patience thinned. The small routines that hold discipline together. Regular meals, proper rest, orderly watches began to break down. In an army, morale is the glue. When the glue starts to dissolve, everything else comes apart with it. In that environment, warning signs began to surface, scattered inconsistent. Reports from auxiliary units contradicted one another. Scouts returned with vague information or did not return at all. Local populations neither resisted nor cooperated. They were silent in a way that felt unnatural. Side roads were empty. Villages lay still, as if hollowed out. To an army on alert, these were red flags. To an army convinced it was suppressing a minor disturbance, they were inconveniences. Varus continued to view everything through an administrative lens. He did not see a system being worn down. He saw a task encountering delays. There was no major reorganization of the march. No significant shift in tactics. The plan continued because the plan provided the illusion of control. And when you believe you are in control, you ignore the signs that you are not. This was the fatal design flaw. Not a single bad decision, but a chain of reasonable decisions made in the wrong context. Rome did not enter the forest as an army about to be hunted. It entered as a machine finishing a job. It did not treat the forest as an enemy. It treated it as a stretch of road, and the forest, more patient than any human opponent, only needed them to keep walking. The column stretched longer, the pace slowed, the gaps between units widened. With every passing hour, the ability to react weakened just a little more. There was no single moment of collapse, no bell tolling doom, only a growing sense of suffocation, as if the air itself were thickening among the trees. And then at the exact moment, the column was longest, slowest, and most vulnerable. The forest answered back. The forest did not answer with shouting, and it did not answer with war horns. It answered with a spear, then another. Not from the front where officers and standards were clustered, not into the center where Roman discipline was still dense enough to protect itself. The first blows struck the edges, the men at the rear, the auxiliaries, the servants, the cavalry leading their horses, the soldiers bent over, hauling wagons out of the mud. From between the dark, rain-soaked trees, spears flew low, hit fast, and vanished. No one stayed to hold ground. No one pressed the attack. Strike. Withdraw. The forest went silent again, as if nothing had moved. This was not a battle in the way Rome understood battles. This was guerrilla warfare in its purest form. Not about taking positions, not about breaking formations all at once. Every strike had a single purpose: to break rhythm. When one man fell at the edge of the column, the entire column was forced to stop. When the column stopped, the order began to crack. Commands that once flowed smoothly with marching feet now had to fight upstream through rain and wind. And when an army trained to fight as a single body is forced to react in fragments, its advantage begins to slip away without a single decisive clash. Varus reacted exactly as a Roman governor was trained to react. He did not panic. He did not order a full counterattack. To him, these were scattered acts of harassment by local warbands, reckless, irritating, but not decisive. He believed that if discipline held, everything would stabilize. Orders were issued, tighten the formation, increase vigilance, and continue the march. Rome had faced this kind of resistance before, and Rome always won. As the attacks repeated, Varus made the most familiar decision in the Roman playbook: build a camp. A camp was not just a place to rest. It was a ritual, a way of telling the soldiers that order still existed, that even in chaos, Rome could impose straight lines in the wilderness. Ditches were dug, stakes were driven, tents were raised. Everything followed procedures, repeated hundreds of times across the empire. This time, the procedure brought no sense of safety. A camp built in the rain was nothing like one built on dry ground. Ditches collapsed into channels of mud. Wooden stakes tilted as the soil gave way. Tents leaked wind, slicing through the canvas. Soldiers worked exhausted, and numb hands, stiff with cold armor, hanging heavy with water. And more importantly, they built the camp in a space they could not fully see. The forest pressed in from every side. There was no horizon, no open ground to breathe. Night fell without a major assault. No charge, no screaming. Only the steady drumming of rain on canvas and the creak of trees in the wind. That made it worse, because an invisible enemy is always more terrifying than one rushing toward you. Soldiers strained their eyes into the darkness, waiting for a blow they could not locate. That waiting eroded nerves faster than combat ever could. While Varus believed he was maintaining order, the real target was not the battle line. It was logistics. Supply wagons were ambushed when they veered off the main track. Draft animals were killed or panicked into the forest, dragging reins and screams with them. Servants and auxiliary troops died quietly without trumpet calls, without protective formations. Every abandoned wagon, every sack of food dumped into the mud to lighten the load was another piece of the empire falling out of the picture. As logistics unraveled, information followed. No one knew exactly how much food remained. No one knew whether the rear was still intact. Orders arrived late, distorted, or not at all. Rumors filled the gaps. Some whispered that the tribes had united. Others said this was only the beginning. Some began to ask why Arminius had not returned. In an army, fear spreads faster than any command. Rome began to go blind, not because it lacked scouts, but because what the scouts reported no longer formed a coherent picture. The forest swallowed sight, the rain swallowed sound, and confidence swallowed the ability to admit that this was no longer a routine suppression. When you do not know where the enemy is, every direction feels like the front. When you do not know what is happening behind you, you cannot advance safely. By the end of the first day, another camp rose in the cold rain. Fires struggled to catch. Armor did not dry. The wounded groaned on soaked ground. Sentries stood hunched eyes fixed on the tree line. There was no victory to celebrate, no clear defeat to retreat from, only the sense that something had gone wrong, even if no one dared say it aloud. And in that damp darkness, a poisonous question began to slip through tents, through small groups of soldiers, through officers trying to reassure themselves. If this was only harassment, why hadn't Arminius come back yet? Night fell carrying a decision Varus could no longer avoid. The first day had passed without a clear battle, but there was also no sign that things would stabilize on their own. The scattered attacks, the long stretches of silence, and Arminius's continued absence made one thing obvious. If they stayed on the current route, the army would be worn down until it could no longer react at all. Varus chose to change direction. Not a full retreat that would have meant admitting failure, but a night march meant to escape the forest and reach more open ground where the legions could recover their familiar shape. This was the moment when a cornered animal tries to bolt. But the forests of Germania did not allow straight lines. In the darkness, rain still fell, the ground remained soft, and every path was narrower than it looked. Orders moved in whispers, passed by runners, by vague hand signals. There were no large torches. They would give away positions. The column began to move in pieces, slow and careful, trying to preserve order in conditions where order itself was a luxury. And the moment they moved, the forest moved with them. The ambushes were not constant and not dramatic, but they repeated with cold precision, never striking the same spot twice, never allowing the Romans to find a rhythm. Spears fell at the front, then the middle, then the rear. When the column halted to react in one place, it was hit somewhere else. When officers tried to concentrate forces at the center, both ends were cut away. Communication collapsed. Messengers vanished into the darkness. Shouts were swallowed by the rain. The army began to be carved into sections, not according to Roman design, but according to the rhythm of the forest. Front, center, and rear were no longer a single body. They became small groups, each convinced it was doing the right thing, each unaware of where the others were. This is the worst state a legion can enter. Discipline still exists within each group, but coordination does not. An army like that can still fight, but it cannot win. In the dark, the line between holding formation and running began to blur. Soldiers who stayed in position kept pace, and followed orders were still struck by spears from places they could not see. They died without knowing where the enemy was, or what mistake they had made. Elsewhere, those who panicked and broke formation to move faster died as well, run down in the mud, isolated from comrades, ambushed when exhaustion caught up to them. Every choice led to the same outcome. This was the cruelest kind of warfare where no behavior is rewarded. Roman discipline had always rested on an unspoken promise. If you did everything right, the system would protect you. In the forests of Germania, that promise broke. Soldiers began to realize there was no safe position, no single correct decision. When discipline no longer brings protection, it begins to crack, not through mutiny, but through fatigue, through slower reactions, through doubtful glances cast toward officers. The column kept moving through the night, but with each passing hour, the gaps between groups grew wider. The wounded were left behind to avoid slowing the march. Supplies were discarded again and again. Familiar symbols of order standards, trumpet calls, lost their meaning in the darkness. Rome could no longer see itself, and when an empire can no longer recognize the shape of the force it commands, control exists only on paper. Near dawn, the terrain began to change in a more dangerous way. The road narrowed, squeezed between a wooded hillside on one side and a deep marsh on the other. Space collapsed. The column could no longer spread out or maneuver. This was exactly the kind of ground every Roman commander was trained to avoid, a choke point where numbers and formation meant nothing. But now, avoidance was no longer an option. Hunted through the night, exhausted and fragmented, the army could only keep moving forward, hoping the space ahead would open up. The forest grew strangely quiet. No major ambush, no decisive blow. Only the feeling that the road was guiding them toward a point of no return. As the gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, the men at the front could finally see the shape of what lay ahead. A hill on one side, a marsh on the other, and a strip of road between them wide enough only for small groups to pass. In that moment, some officers began to understand what they should have realized earlier. This was no series of accidents. This was a chosen corridor, a place where the army was being forced to move to someone else's rhythm. By the morning of the third day, Rome entered a passage built for only one purpose: to die. The dawn of the third day brought no hope. It only made the trap easier to see. As gray light filtered through the canopy, the Roman column finally saw the shape of the road. They had been forced into a narrow strip of ground, squeezed tightly between a wooded hillside and a black, choking marsh. The space here was not just tight, it had the character of a room. A long, narrow room with the doors locked at both ends. You could not deploy formations. You could not spread out to envelop the enemy. You could not maneuver to counterattack, the way Romans were trained to fight. You could only move forward, or stop, and be crushed into a mass of bodies on the road itself. On a map, it looks terrifyingly simple. A corridor, a few hundred meters long, dense forest, and marsh on one side, high ground on the other. But maps cannot convey the sensation of being squeezed. The marsh is not water. It is deep mud that swallows legs and pulls you down if you misstep. The hill is not just high ground. It is a slick slope where you must attack uphill without seeing who stands above you. The road between them is not a path. It is a choke point. The neck of a snake, and whoever grips the neck controls the life of the body. This is exactly the kind of terrain an experienced Roman commander would avoid at all costs. But Varus no longer had a choice. The army had been worn down for 2 days, cut apart, stripped of supplies, robbed of rhythm and confidence. If they turned back, they would turn back into forest rain, and chaos a slow suicide. If they went forward, at least there was hope that the ground would open up. Hope is the last thing an army clings to when everything else is gone, and the forests of Germania understood that. Calcresa did not feel like a battlefield. It felt like a slaughterhouse built out of terrain. And in a slaughterhouse, the killer does not need to be stronger. He only needs to stand in the right place. Then something the Romans had not seen in the darkness became visible in the light: a wall. Not a Roman stone wall, but a crude structure, packed earth timber, rough barriers running along the hillside, forming a protected line for the attackers. It did not need to be tall. It only needed to hide the men throwing spears to block sight lines, to make every Roman reaction one beat slower. And in war, a single beat is enough to die. From behind that barrier, the attacks began. Not once, again and again. In rhythm, spears rained down onto the narrow road. Shouts rose and were swallowed by the forest. The Romans tried to push forward, but every step was taken at a disadvantage. On one side was the marsh: no footing, no maneuver, no retreat. On the other side was the hill, and its barrier: any counterattack meant charging uphill through slick mud, while the enemy enjoyed cover and elevation. This was an asymmetry that armor and formation could not fix. Rome was forced to do what it hated most: fight without control. Legionaries tried to form ranks on the narrow road, but there was no space to raise a proper wall of shields. The front was struck, the rear pressed forward, and the formation collapsed into a knot. Discipline did not vanish instantly. It tried to survive like a reflex, but the reflex no longer matched reality. There were brief, violent moments when small groups of legionaries surged up the slope to break the barrier. They climbed, slipped, climbed again. They glimpsed figures behind the earthworks. Then those figures vanished, and another spear flew. These counterattacks did not fail for lack of courage. They failed because the terrain had already decided the outcome. You cannot be brave and your way out of a choke point. You can only be crushed by it. Then the collapse began, not like an explosion, but like a series of snapped cords. Trumpet calls sounded and died away, not because the trumpeters were dead, but because no one could hear them. Standards swayed in the rain, then vanished among the trees, and no one knew which unit they stood with anymore. Officers shouted orders, but the orders reached no one because no one had become many small disconnected groups. Shields fell into the mud, not because men dropped them willingly, but because their arms were too exhausted to hold on. Soldiers were shoved off the road into the marsh and disappeared into black mud, like mouths swallowing them whole. Others were pressed against the barrier, struck by spears from above, and then fell back into the mass behind them, panic spreading like fire through dry grass. In moments like this, a legion no longer exists. Only people do. People shoving, trampling, desperately searching for an exit. And the cruelest truth was this: there was no exit. No left flank to turn. No right flank to open. No rear guard to reorganize. Only a corridor growing tighter as bodies piled into it. Varus understood before everything fully dissolved. He was not a fool, but he was a man trained to believe that order could always be restored with commands. At Calcrease, order was no longer something you could rebuild. It was something already lost. When Varus saw the barrier, saw his army pinned between hill and marsh, saw units cut off from one another, he faced the truth no Roman commander wanted to face. This was the end. And so he chose to end it in the Roman way. Varus took his own life, not as a grand gesture, but as a cold admission that escape was impossible and capture unthinkable. In Roman culture, being taken alive meant the loss of honor. For Varus, death was the last remaining form of control over his own fate. After that, the three legions, 17, 18, and 19, were effectively erased, not because every man died in a single instant, but because their entire structure was smashed beyond recovery. Estimates placed the dead and the missing at between 16 and 20,000. Any survivors were captured, sold, or turned into warnings Rome preferred not to repeat. And what made this defeat so haunting was not just the number. It was the realization that an empire could be killed in a way that did not fit its own image. And now, the payoff to the poisonous question, whispered on the first night, becomes clear. Arminius had not failed to return. Arminius had never truly left. He had only changed roles. No longer the guide walking ahead of the column, but the man standing in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, watching Rome come apart inside the death corridor he had chosen. Bad news did not reach Rome as a clean, orderly report. It arrived in fragments, like bones collected from a forest. First came whispers units that failed to return on schedule messengers who vanished northern routes that fell unnaturally silent. Then came scattered survivors, filthy, exhausted, telling stories that didn't fully align yet, all sharing the same core truth. There had been no single battle in the familiar sense, only a prolonged unraveling. Finally, the pieces formed a conclusion that could not be avoided. 3 legions had vanished, not retreated, not regrouped, vanished. When the news reached Augustus, it did not feel like a military defeat. It felt like a blow to the psychological foundation of the empire. The emperor, a man accustomed to seeing maps bend to his will, was now confronted with a void that could not be filled by orders. Ancient sources tell us Augustus became obsessed, pacing the palace, striking his head against the walls, calling out Varus's name in despair. Whether the details are exaggerated or not, the psychological image is unmistakable. This was not a loss that could be managed. It was a shock that cracked the belief that Rome could always fix mistakes with force. Rome did not just lose men. Rome lost the story it told about itself. An empire survives on the belief that its order is irreversible, and somewhere in a distant forest, that order had been shredded in rain and mud. There were no grand state funerals for 20,000 dead, no monuments worthy of the legions that were gone, only a quiet obsession that spread through council chambers and barracks alike. If this could happen in Germania, where else could it happen? Rome's first response was ritualized silence. 3 legionary numbers, Scatith, Teutoburg, were removed from the rolls, never reused, never revived. In an empire where tradition and symbols were the backbone of identity, this was an extreme act. Legion numbers were not just numbers. They were memory honor and accumulated glory passed from one generation to the next. Erasing them was Rome's way of admitting that some stains cannot be washed away, only buried. Think about that in Roman terms. A legion could be defeated and later reconstituted, carrying its lessons and its vengeance forward, but these 3 could not. They became taboo numbers, names not spoken aloud, not because Rome forgot them, but because Rome did not want to remember. It was a form of sealed memory, a reminder that power has limits, and that crossing those limits can leave scars that never heal. From that moment on, a border was no longer just a line on a map. It became a way of thinking. Before Teutoburg, Rome dreamed of conquest. After Teutoburg, Rome dreamed of holding. The ambition of endless expansion, the force that had carried Rome across seas, deserts, and mountains, was now restrained by a new question: at what cost? The Rhine, once merely a geographic obstacle, became a strategic decision, a reminder that not every land was worth 20,000 lives, and the collapse of a myth. The Rhine was no longer just water flowing east and west. It was the boundary between what Rome understood and what Rome could not control with familiar formulas. On one bank, roads, garrisons, taxes, law. On the other, forests, marshes, and societies that did not operate on imperial schedules. After Teutoburg, Rome stopped seeing Germania as a province waiting to be absorbed. It saw it as a dangerous space that had to be contained. Ambition shifted into defense. Speed gave way to caution. But empires do not endure by fear alone. The shock created an open question Rome could not ignore: could lost honor be reclaimed? And if so, how 20,000 vanished men were not just a statistic. They were a direct challenge to the image of invincibility Rome had cultivated for generations. A challenge like that could not be left unanswered forever. It demanded a response not only military, but symbolic. That is why the story does not end at Colchis. It only changes chapters. Rome would not forget. Rome would not allow the stain to remain untouched. In the years that followed, new expeditions would be prepared, more cautious, more calculated, aimed not at conquest, but at punishment, and proof that the blow at Teutoburg was not the final word. A new name would step onto the stage, carrying the weight of wounded honor and the expectations of an empire. The question hanging in the air, and it is not just for Rome, but for us, is this: can revenge repair a failure that was systemic in nature, or does it only expose once again the limits that Teutoburg forced into the open? The answer would come with new legions crossing the Rhine under the command of Germanicus. Rome's anger did not explode all at once. It accumulated. It was packaged into plans, and when it was finally released, it carried a name: Germanicus. From 14 to 16 AD, the legions that crossed the Rhine were not there to expand the frontier as before, but to cleanse a humiliation. The objectives were clear, not abstract: punish the tribes that had taken part, shatter the alliances that had formed, and above all, recover what had been taken. This was not a war to rule. This was a war to send a message. Germanicus did not repeat Varus's mistakes. He marched with more flexible forces, heavily supported, choosing open ground when possible, and withdrawing when it was not. His campaigns followed a sharp rhythm strike: fast strike deep, then pull back across the river. Villages were burned. Alliances were broken apart. Chieftains were hunted, forced to scatter or flee. Rome was not searching for a single decisive battle to claim land. It was searching for symbolic moments of punishment enough to prove that Teutoburg had not turned Rome into something weak. In the course of these campaigns, Germanicus deliberately returned to the site of the catastrophe itself, not to conquer it, but to see it. Bones still lay on the ground, bleached fragments mixed with mud, rusted scraps of armor half buried in the soil. This was not a military victory. It was a ritual, a confrontation with a memory Rome had tried to seal away. And there, the true objective of revenge came into focus more clearly than ever: the eagles. The aquila was not just a symbol mounted on a pole. To Rome, it was the soul of a legion. It embodied the oath, collective honor, and the continuity between generations of soldiers. Losing an aquila was not like losing a flag. It was like losing a heart. A legion could be rebuilt. Soldiers could be recruited again. But a soul taken by the enemy was a wound that never fully healed. Teutoburg not only took lives, it took the symbol by which Rome defined itself. Recovering the eagles therefore meant far more than tactical success. In the years 1516, 2 of them were recovered through separate operations, not in grand set-piece battles, but through raids, coercion, and forced negotiations. Each eagle brought back was a psychological release. Rome could say that part of its honor had returned, but what haunted them was the third. It was not recovered quickly. It remained somewhere beyond Rome's control, a constant reminder that the story was not yet closed. It was not until the year 41 that the final aquila was returned, 32 years, long enough for memory to harden into scar tissue. This is the emotional payoff of the entire disaster. Rome did not just lose soldiers. Rome lost symbols. And the fact that it took decades to reclaim them says what casualty numbers cannot the blow had pierced the empire's psychological armor. When it takes 30 years to retrieve your own soul, you are no longer invulnerable. So why, after revenge was taken, after punishment was delivered, after most of the symbols were recovered, did Rome still not return to conquer Germania? The answer is not courage. It is a calculation. First, the cost outweighed the benefit. Forest and marsh turned logistics into a nightmare. Every mile advanced required an extended chain of protection, and every chain became a target. You could win individual battles, but to hold land, you had to feed it, garrison it, and supply it. Germania did not allow that on Rome's terms. Second, there was no central power to control, no capital to seize, no court to replace, no political choke point to tighten. You could break one alliance today, and another would form tomorrow. Rome's model of rule, conquer, garrison, legislate required a corresponding structure on the other side to replace. Germania offered none. Third Teutoburg left a strategic scar. Not blind fear, but caution learned through blood. After that shock, Rome understood that some lands should not become provinces because the price paid did not scale with the reward. Holding firmly to what already existed became more important than expanding blindly. The Rhine, therefore, was not just a river. It was a decision repeated across generations. Looking back, a clear pattern emerges. Teutoburg was not a collapse born of weakness. It was a failure born of a system applied in the wrong environment. Rome was strongest when it turned space into order-straight roads, laws, schedules. Germania refused to be transformed that way. And in that refusal, the empire ran into the limits of its own design. This is the final echo of the story. Rome was not defeated by brute force. Rome was defeated by a place it could not turn into order. And that may be history's coldest lesson. Not every land fits a winning formula, and not every defeat can be repaired by revenge. If you were Varus, when the map tells you one thing, the system tells you another, and the man guiding you forward is the trap itself, what would you have done differently?